Hey there, my Why Religion friends. Professor Anthony Sweat from BYU Religion here. There's this really fabulous tool that I like to use when I'm researching different doctrinal subjects. It's called the General Conference Corpus. Maybe you've heard of it. It's available to everybody for free on the web. Just Google it if you're interested. This corpus allows you to quickly and easily search talks from all of General Conference from 1851 down to the present. And it quickly and cleanly breaks down and normalizes the data into really easily readable histograms organized by decade. One of the reasons why I love this database is because I can see how teachings in the church have developed and changed over time. Yes, changed over time. For example, is the modern church teaching more or less about the doctrine of grace in comparison to previous decades? Well, a quick search shows that in the 2010s, the word grace was used 3 times as much as in the 1980s, and 5 times as much as 100 years earlier in the 1910s. But on the other hand, if you search a phrase like the word of wisdom, you will see that teachings on the word of wisdom have recently declined. They were given 10 times as much in General Conference 100 years ago than they are today. They peaked during Prohibition in the 1920s and 1930s. References to pornography, however, jumped dramatically in the 2000s as the internet hit popular mainstream. But pornography was not mentioned much, if at all, prior to 1970. Interestingly, the phrase heavenly parents has been said 124 total times in all of General Conference history. But listen to this. 64 of them, half of them, have been said in the last decade alone, as the church has wrestled with questions over and taught on concepts related to same-sex marriage and women's equality with men in the church. You may be asking yourself, what do these data points about General Conference have anything to do with Joseph Smith and the year 1842? Well, my friends, they have everything to do with it. Professor Jordan Watkins from BYU's Department of Church History and Doctrine was one of the volume editors of one of the most recent Joseph Smith Papers publications called Documents Volume 10, dealing with Joseph Smith's life from May to August of 1842, and the many demands, concerns, and questions that Joseph faced. Listen to what Dr. Watkins concludes about this period.
And I suppose part of the point to make here, and I think this is true, you can see this throughout the volume, is that Joseph's very real circumstances are inspiring his thoughts about divine things, right? So the temporal and the eternal are very much enmeshed. The temporal, to some extent, is giving shape to the eternal, even as the eternal that Joseph is revealing is answering temporal problems. And I think in our own lives, right, sometimes we want to separate and divide out those two things. It might not even be that useful to talk about the temporal and the eternal. The eternal, to some extent, encompasses it all.
In today's episode of Why Religion, get ready to spend the summer of 1842 with the prophet Joseph Smith, and to learn from his incredibly busy, demanding, and difficult circumstances, and how those circumstances may have inspired his prophetic teachings. We may not want to think that the heavenly world is connected to our earthly cares, but upon deeper introspection, we actually want and need them to be. After all, if God somehow spoke things unrelated to our context and time, how redemptive would the gospel be? The truth is that the temporal often gives rise to the spiritual. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Although we typically do 3 parts in each episode of Why Religion, this interview just naturally developed a little bit differently and meshed into 2 parts and not 3, where Professor Watkins gave some great application that was interwoven with his own family, faith, and academic journey. So rather than try to parse it and split it out into 3 parts, as the producer, I'm just letting it stay in its more organic form on this episode and breaking it into 2. It's really, really good. In part 1, Jordan Watkins will share his amazing research and give us some fascinating snapshots of 4 months of Joseph Smith's life at maybe the zenith of his prophetic powers and temporal concerns. In this part, he discusses Joseph Smith's teachings on the endowment, the rise and fall of John C. Bennett, Joseph as the mayor, the continued implementation of plural marriage, the attempted extradition of Joseph Smith that tied him to former Governor Lilburn Boggs' attempted assassination, Joseph going into hiding for a few weeks in August, and Joseph recording the names of some of the faithful in the book of the law of the Lord. They'll explain that. And as I mentioned in part 2, Professor Watkins will go more into some application and his own faith and family perspectives. Here then is Professor Jordan Watkins being interviewed by his colleague, Professor Casey Griffiths, about his contribution to the Joseph Smith Papers publication, taking us through the summer of 1842.
Tell us about Volume 10. What are the highlights here? What's the general series of events that's happening in the summer of 1842 that Joseph Smith is dealing with?
Well, summer of 1842, there are highlights and there are lowlights.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on.
There's a lot of stuff going on. I think one way to talk about this volume is to sort of talk about, so there's 105 documents, right? But it covers these 4 months, May, June, July, and August of 1842. And you'll find the word tumultuous used multiple times in this volume that I think accurately summarizes the period. One way to sort of highlight what's going on in Volume 10 is to take a look at what are the first documents and what are the last documents in the volume. The first document in the volume is a May 1 discourse.
Okay.
Joseph gives a sermon in the Grove in Nauvoo. And in that sermon, he says, he's talking about the keys of the kingdom, what he calls the keys of the kingdom. And he describes these keys as certain signs and words. And he says that the elders have to know them all to be endued with power. Well, it's only 3 days later, on May 4th and 5th, that he introduces 9 men to the endowment in the red brick store, in the upper room of the red brick store. So this document is anticipating that event. So really, Volume 10 starts with a bang, and some sacred events and sacred rituals.
I'm looking at the discourse right now. If I can read an excerpt, it says, I preached in the Grove on the keys of kingdom, charity, etc. The keys are certain signs and words by which false spirits and personages may be detected from true, which cannot be revealed to the elders till the temple is completed. The rich can get them in the temple. The poor may get them on the mountaintop, as did Moses. So it's like the temple's being built, but he's so anxious to disseminate this knowledge. He's saying, I've got to tell you about this right now.
Exactly.
Because of this impoverished state that the saints are in.
Yes. And again, Elizabeth King could talk about all the debt that they're dealing with at this time. Even still, they're pushing to complete the temple, but there is a sense that Joseph feels like he's got to get this endowment to at least a number of individuals. And he'll, of course, introduce more in 1843.
He's giving it to a small group right now, but he's telling everybody about the endowment.
Well, he's at least hinting at that, right? Not everybody may know what he's talking about, but he's actually spoken on this issue before. In fact, a couple of days earlier, on April 28th, he's speaking to the Relief Society, and he tells them he's about to give them the keys of the kingdom, and so that they can discern everything false. So very similar language. So he is referencing these ideas, and Willard Richards says that on the occasion that he gives these 9 men the endowment, he says that these things will be made known to the least saint as fast as they are able to receive them, and a place is prepared. Right? So yes, he's introducing specific people, a fairly small group of people, to the endowment and related ordinances, but it's clear that he has a plan that all of these ordinances will be given to all the saints once the temple is completed.
And it's interesting to see teachings like that I don't think were very well known. intermixed with teachings, quotes in here that I've heard my whole life. Like there's a discourse of the Relief Society where he says, "Nothing is so much calculated to lead people to forsake sin as to take them by the hand and watch over them with tenderness. When persons manifest the least kindness and love to me, what power it has over my mind, while the opposite course has a tendency to harrow up all the harsh feelings and depress the human minds." That's a quote I've heard all my life, but it was interesting to see it in context. He's talking to the Relief Society, and it's in a discourse where he does, again, hint at those higher covenants, those higher things that a person has to commit to in the temple.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of these volumes, is that they allow us to see these teachings in context. I mentioned how the volume opens, right, with this sermon related to or anticipating the introduction of the endowment. The volume ends with a number of documents that are related to an attempt to extradite Joseph Smith to Missouri for trial. Now, I think that's important to note, that you have these profound sacred truths and rituals being presented, while at the same time you have Joseph dealing with some very difficult trials, and the saints dealing with some very difficult trials. And I think that highlights an important point about the events that take place in the summer of 1842, but also the event of the Restoration itself. And that is that God is working through Joseph Smith, not despite his struggles and trials, not despite the difficulties that they face, but in relationship to those difficulties. And that can be seen in a number of ways in Volume 10. One of the things to note is that Joseph is exceptionally busy during this period. There's a June letter that Wilford Woodruff writes to Parley P. Pratt, and he tells him, Joseph, I've never seen him more busy, hardly has time to sign his name. He, of course, he has ecclesiastical affairs to watch over, familial affairs, which becomes increasingly complicated. He becomes the mayor of Nauvoo during this period.
Right. Which is a whole story in and of itself.
Which is a whole story in and of itself. He is overseeing land transactions. He's the editor of the Times and Seasons. He's a store clerk. As he becomes mayor, he also takes on the role of overseeing the mayor's court, overseeing the municipal court. He's exceptionally busy. Add on to that the fallout of John C. Bennett during this period, and we're dealing with, again, a tumultuous 4 months.
Now, John C. Bennett is a figure that pops up. I mean, you can't discuss Nauvoo without discussing John C. Bennett, but give us kind of, what does this document say about John C. Bennett? This is kind of the period when John C. Bennett his misdeeds are being brought to light. He's kind of launched a war of words against Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is responding. This has some minutes, I believe, where he's brought before the city council and confesses what's going on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. John C. Bennett really sort of haunts Joseph's every step through much of this period. Bennett had arrived in Nauvoo in September of 1840 and had risen on the scene very rapidly. He's baptized. He helps obtain the Nauvoo City Charter. He becomes Nauvoo's mayor. He becomes assistant president.
He's a tremendously gifted individual.
He is.
He's charismatic. If you look up his bio on the JSP site, it's small print, huge stuff. He does everything from popularize the use of the tomato to found fake universities. I mean,
yes,
right. He's got a lot of energy.
He's got a lot of energy. And Joseph clearly trusts him, but Joseph also knows that there's the potential for trouble. Bennett has arrived presenting himself as a single man, as a bachelor. But Joseph's heard rumors that he has a wife and 2 kids back in Ohio. So even early on, Joseph senses, at least knows that there is perhaps the potential for trouble. But that really comes to a head during these summer months of 1842. At a certain point before this, Bennett is courting a woman, or starts to court a woman. Joseph approaches him, and based on the rumors he has heard, and Bennett promises that he'll cease pursuing that relationship and reform. Subsequently, Bennett says that Joseph is sanctioning the promiscuous intercourse between the sexes. And Bennett is telling women and men this in Nauvoo. Joseph, according to his own account, hears of this, again approaches Bennett, tells him to stop. Bennett says that he will, but apparently continues to pursue that same kind of behavior. And it's at that point that church leaders, this is in May of 1842, determine that they are going to withdraw fellowship from John C. Bennett. And they write up a notice withdrawing fellowship. Not too long after that, on May 17th, Bennett resigns as mayor of Nauvoo. 2 days later is when the city council meets. And Joseph, in that meeting, is actually elected mayor in his stead. Fairly soon after that, Joseph comes out publicly against Bennett in June, and by June 21st, Bennett has left Nauvoo. And then within a couple of weeks, Bennett is publishing, sending letters to the Sangamo Journal, making all kinds of allegations about Joseph Smith, describing him as a licentious fraud. Bennett claims that Joseph has proposed to Sarah Pratt, Orson Pratt's wife, while Orson Pratt was away. Incidentally, Orson Pratt hears another rumor when he gets back as well, and that is that Bennett has had an affair with Sarah Pratt. He doesn't know who to believe. That creates problems between Orson Pratt and the leaders of the church that aren't resolved until 1843. So Bennett is making all kinds of accusations. Add to this the complication that Joseph has introduced plural marriage. He's already married a number of other women by this point. And during the summer of 1842, documents suggest that he marries an additional 4 women. Eliza R. Snow, Delsena Sherman, Martha Knight, and Elizabeth Ann Whitney. Now, the only contemporary document, the only sealing that we have a contemporary document for is the Elizabeth Ann Whitney sealing.
Which is in this volume. And incredibly valuable.
This is a revelation given on July 27th, 1842. Now, this is the only document we have wherein Joseph provides, it's the only revelation we have that provides instructions on how to perform a plural marriage sealing.
Yeah, and the supporting material surrounding this is amazing. For instance, her parents are close friends with Joseph Smith going all the way back to 1831, correct?
Yes.
And they participate in the ceremony. In fact, the revelation instructs Newell K. Whitney, her father, on how to perform the ceremony. This was a real gem that I was amazed to see here. Can I read a little bit of the ceremony? Sure. The instructions read, "They shall take each other by the hand, and you shall say, you both mutually agree, calling them by name, to be each other's companions so long as you both shall live, preserving yourselves for each other and from all others, and also throughout eternity, reserving only those rights which have been given to my servant Joseph by revelation and command and by legal authority in times past." And the Whitneys preserved this document, correct? They're the ones that kind of keep it safe, and it comes to the church through Orson F. Whitney, who's a descendant here, an apostle in the 20th century.
Well, if you read that in the source note, that's what's true.
That's what I read. I hope it's accurate.
I think that's accurate. Elizabeth Keene worked on this document, so she has that insight. But yes, this clearly is an important event for the Whitney family, and part of what the instruction says is that this sealing will secure the salvation not just of Sarah Ann, but of her family. This document, it's one document, but we don't have a lot of documents contemporaneous with these sealings. And I think what this document suggests is that Joseph does have a sense that these plural marriages are part of an effort to seal together people horizontally. So sometimes we talk about that vertically, right, with baptism for the dead. But it's this sense of creating these ties horizontally, and that leading to sort of a collective salvation.
By horizontal ties, you mean he's creating
Across
like this
space.
family organization.
Yeah.
Because you start to notice plural marriage is of course difficult for a lot of church members, but when you start to put the sealings in context, these were his close friends, and it's almost like he's trying to create this large extended family through these sealings to people like the Whitneys.
Yeah, and Catherine Danes and Richard Bushman and other scholars have made this claim, or rather, I should say that they have made this argument. And this document, I think, gives some credence to that particular understanding of how Joseph sees these plural marriage sealings. But I think it bears noting that, of course, this is messy, especially complicated by what's going on with John C. Bennett and the claims that he's making, right? So we want it, sometimes we want our history to be nice and tidy and neat. And for one, the documents don't allow for that, right? Because they're so scattered and especially when it comes to plural marriage, we just don't have a lot of contemporaneous documents. But really, people's lives aren't like that, right? It's not only the complication of plural marriage and whatever it was that John C. Bennett was doing, but add to that the complication of Joseph Smith's potential extradition, in which John C. Bennett gets involved, or at least claims he's willing to get involved. So there had been attempts to extradite Joseph Smith previously for charges related to the Missouri War, or the Mormon War of 1838.
And here they're also dealing with an attempted assassination on Lilburn Boggs.
Here they're dealing with an attempted assassination on Lilburn Boggs. That takes place on May 6th. News arrives in Nauvoo that he's actually been assassinated. They only later find out that it was an attempted assassination. And in May, fairly soon after the attempt, rumors start to fly that, perhaps the Latter-day Saints were involved. Perhaps Joseph Smith was involved. The Latter-day Saints are very nervous about that claim. Joseph Smith, of course, denies that allegation in a couple of instances. But they become very concerned that, perhaps Missouri will try to extradite Joseph Smith. And so they establish a new night watch. The city council meets and they establish, they pass a new law that strengthens the power of the municipal court to hear habeas corpus cases, right? So a habeas corpus case is, or the right of habeas corpus allows an individual who has been arrested to petition for a writ of habeas corpus. And that petition demands that the individual be brought before a local justice to determine if the arresting warrant is valid. Joseph had successfully used this previously in 1841. Well, now in the summer of 1842, they're concerned that a habeas corpus case may arise again, and so they're passing laws that give greater power to the municipal court in Nauvoo to be able to hear habeas corpus cases. They're also petitioning Illinois Governor Thomas Carlin, saying, hey, if something comes of this, can we count on you? And he'll write back and say, I don't think it's what you think it is. I don't think it'll happen. Joseph is also concerned that a mob will come on Nauvoo. Of course, that is Missouri haunting him, that sensibility, that idea. So saints are very worried about this. And of course, it does come to a head in July. In fact, as the saints are sending people to Thomas Carlin to petition him to not do anything if an extradition attempt is made, there is a request for an extradition finding its way up from Missouri, and that arrives at the office of Thomas Carlin. And within days of him essentially saying, you don't really have to worry, Joseph Smith, he signs an arrest warrant. And days later, you have officers arriving in Nauvoo and arresting Joseph Smith and Orrin Porter Rockwell. Now, at that occasion, Joseph petitions for writ of habeas corpus, and because he knows the recent laws that have been made, and he is brought before the municipal court answers that call, issues writ of habeas corpus, and Henry Sherwood, the city marshal, takes it to the arresting officers. They're confused. They don't know if this is legit or if it's legal, but they say, okay, we'll go ask Carlin. They leave Joseph in the hands of the marshal, and then they leave town. And what does Joseph and Orrin Porter Rockwell do? Well, they're out of there. They cross the Mississippi River into Iowa territory because they know that this is going to continue to go on. And during the next couple of weeks, they're in and out of hiding. And I think that's an interesting phase. So we're into August.
Just to contextualize that too, I was struck by a discourse in here where all this legal maneuvering is happening on purpose. Joseph gives a discourse where he says, he had told them formally about fighting the Missourians and about fighting alone. He had not fought them with the sword, nor by carnal weapons. He had done it by stratagem and by outwitting them. And there had been no lives lost, and there would be no lives lost if they would hearken to his counsel. So all this legal maneuvering is because he's very, very attuned to the bloodshed that happened in Missouri, and he wants to prevent it. And so he's trying to use the system to maximum advantage so that there's not a violent confrontation with these people that are prone to using violence, that have used violence against the saints before.
Yeah, that brings up a good point. You can see the specter of Missouri haunting the saints certainly throughout this period.
Yeah, in the same discourse he talks about Haun's Mill, and it's hanging kind of as a cloud over everything that he does.
It is. An interesting moment occurs, or a series of moments occurs during this period in August. Joseph, so the discourse you mentioned occurs after he returns from hiding.
Right.
He'll pretty soon, within days, go back into hiding.
Mm-hmm.
But before this discourse, he's in hiding, and you can tell that he's pretty reflective. He starts to think about the people who had helped him in the current crisis and that were helping him in the current crisis. But then it expands into this broad reflection about all the people who've helped him throughout their lives. I should say who've helped him throughout his life, and including family members who have passed. I mean, he mentions Alvin.
Mm-hmm. He goes through every member of his family.
He goes through all of them. He mentions Emma.
Yeah.
There's a great quotation here I'll mention. He says, "With what unspeakable delight and what transports of joy swelled my bosom when I took by the hand on that night." And he's referring to a night when he met with a number of his close friends while he was being pursued by his enemies. When I took by the hand on that night my beloved Emma, she that was my wife, even the wife of my youth and the choice of my heart. Many were the reverberations of my mind when I contemplated for a moment the many past scenes we had been called to pass through, the fatigues and the toils and the sorrows and the sufferings, and the joys and the consolations from time to time had strewed our paths and crowned our board. Oh, what a commingling of thought filled my mind for that moment. Again she is here, even in the seventh trouble, undaunted, firm and unwavering, unchangeable, affectionate Emma. Now, the context of this makes it a bit more complicated. Joseph's got plural wives, and he just recently was sealed to another plural wife, and Emma doesn't know about some of these marriages. But I do think that he's very sincere in this reflection. And another fascinating part of this naming of Emma and of Alvin and of Don Carlos and of others who have helped him, you can sense that while he's isolated, he's trying to bring people close to him through memory and through writing down their names. He's telling William Clayton to record these people's names. And where is he recording them? He's recording them in a book called the Book of the Law of the Lord.
Tell us a little bit about the Book of the Law of the Lord. It's mentioned a lot in the volume.
It is mentioned a lot in the volume. Book of the Law of the Lord had been created a couple of years in Nauvoo. And what was the purpose? Well, the purpose was to record tithing donations. But it seems as though this document has even a longer history. So if you go back to an 1832 revelation, Joseph Smith writes to William W. Phelps and tells him that a record should be created, and that in this record they should record the names of the faithful, and not only their names, but their actions. Well, fast forward 10 years later to the summer of 1842, Joseph uses the Book of the Law of the Lord as a record of tithing donations, but also as his journal. And he starts to have Clayton record the names of these individuals. And on that occasion, on the 16th of August, he says that these are the ones that shall inherit eternal life. There's this very clear sense that this document has some kind of salvific power, or at least that it has some connection to the afterlife. It's no surprise that within a couple of weeks, and this goes a little bit beyond the time period covered in the volume, but when he's in hiding again, what does he write to the saints about? baptism for the dead,
Right.
and the importance of keeping records of those baptisms, right? So it's the sense that these records have the ability to stand in for the dead, right? So they'll be judged according to their works done in the flesh. I think another useful comparison here is, remember habeas corpus. What is habeas corpus? Well, you present a document, and that document has the individual come before a justice of the peace to determine the legality of that document. What are these documents being created on earth? Well, they're going to stand in for those who are dead, and they're going to make sure that they receive a fair trial. And Joseph actually says in a later discourse, he had found a writ of habeas corpus for the dead.
That's what this is, the book of the law of the Lord.
That's essentially, in a way, what it is. The records that are kept about for baptisms. That's what it is. And I suppose part of the point to make here, and I think this is true, you can see this throughout the volume, is that Joseph's very real circumstances are inspiring his thoughts about divine things, right? So the temporal and the eternal are very much enmeshed. The temporal, to some extent, is giving shape to the eternal, even as the eternal that Joseph is revealing is answering temporal problems. And I think in our own lives, right, sometimes we want to separate and divide out those two things. It might not even be that useful to talk about the temporal and the eternal. The eternal, to some extent, encompasses it all. I just had this thought, and maybe it won't be too articulate, but Joseph is a social person, right? Based on what we know about him, based on the biographies that have been written, he cares deeply about relationships, and I think depends on relationships in very significant ways, which makes the experience in Liberty Jail extremely difficult. I mean, thank goodness he has other, not thank goodness for them, I suppose, but thank goodness he has other people to share that with. And my point is, so when he goes into hiding, and I don't want to overstate it, he's not super isolated. He's actually in and around Nauvoo during most of this time, and usually there's someone there with him. But as a social being, he is missing those relationships. And so he's becoming very reflective. I think God, knows that about Joseph Smith, his need for these relationships. And it makes sense to me that someone like Joseph is thinking about how to secure these relationships, and that God is using him to reveal teachings and practices that have power to secure these relationships in eternity. It's no surprise to me that it's Joseph the prophet who says that the same sociality which exists here will exist there. I think part of that's him wanting it to exist, but also God revealing through him that it can exist. So that's another indication of God speaking to Joseph Smith according to his language and circumstances. And even those very trying and difficult circumstances, God is using, I believe, to reveal truth to Joseph Smith.
If you're interested in reading Professor Watkins and the other fabulous editors' work on Joseph Smith Papers Documents, Volume 10, you can go buy the book, of course, but the beauty of the Joseph Smith Papers project is that they make all of this available for free online on the Joseph Smith Papers website. Just go to josephsmithpapers.org and click on the Documents tab, and you can go right to the year 1842 to see and read about these documents being discussed in this episode. We've also put a link to it on our Why Religion webpage at whyreligion.byu.edu, along with a bio of Jordan Watkins. And remember that if you want to connect with us at Why Religion, comment and give your insights on episodes that you've listened to, see some behind-the-scenes photos and get bonus material, give us a follow on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast. Okay, we've arrived at our combined part 2 and 3 on this episode, where the professor discusses why this research publication matters for the everyday saint to help us learn, live, and apply the gospel. And also in this part, how Professor Watkins came to BYU and why, in his own words, he chooses faith. In this segment, listen to how Jordan applies many of the concepts Joseph Smith taught during this Nauvoo period, including the sealing ties related to some family tragedy, why using our minds is an important part of exercising our faith, and how the revelations of God, celestial in nature but rooted in the material world, can help us to address and overcome some of the difficult issues that we face here in mortality.
Tell us a little bit about your journey through academia, how you wound up at BYU.
Sure.
And we'd also like to know how you maintain your testimony in the midst of all this complexity that you encounter.
Yeah. If somebody asks me, why do I believe? I have to say one of the reasons I believe is perhaps nature, but certainly nurture. I grew up in Alpine, Utah, descended from Latter-day Saints on both sides of my family. It's in my blood. When I was young, I thought it was strange not to be a Latter-day Saint, right? I mean, that's the context in which I lived. And now the world's much bigger now. Now I see things differently. But those family ties, those social ties, those cultural ties are still powerful. I mean, I live in Provo, Utah, and I teach religion at BYU, right? So what happens when you come to know a world that is much bigger than you thought it was? Well, and you're faced with the prospect that, well, there are other organizations, there are other ways to believe and disbelieve that are reasonable, that are even inspiring. Well, what then? Well, then you're faced with a choice. And so choosing to believe, well, why do I choose to believe? Well, partly it's, as I suggested, nurture, but it's also experience in encountering the divine through reading the Book of Mormon or through reading Joseph Smith's Revelations, through experiences with fellow church members, through experiences with family members. And sometimes those are really positive, good, inspiring, happy experiences, and sometimes they're not. I think of, so I lost my youngest sister, Micah, to suicide in 2012. And that when an event like that happens, it presents you with a choice. What do you believe? Do you believe? And in light of that experience, I have made that choice again to believe. Micah and her older sister, my younger sister Jasmine, were sealed to us soon after they were
adopted sisters.
Yes.
I remember when you came to her, you presented and showed a picture of Micah, and I was sort of hoping you'd bring it up, but it's such a sensitive issue. I didn't want to bring it up on there. But tell me a little bit about that from that perspective of someone you loved, someone that is your sister, going away in that manner, and how it affects your faith.
Right. It's of course, a crushing experience, right? It's by far the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with. But again, it also presented me with that option. What do I believe? And they were both adopted at birth. A few months after Micah's adoption, they were sealed to us in the Salt Lake Temple. I desperately want that temple sealing to be legitimate and real and true, right? And I believe that it is. So in the face of that kind of predicament, it actually inspires me with greater hope in the powers, the practices, the beliefs restored through Joseph Smith. The early saints led messy lives, and in that messiness, they chose to believe. We live messy lives, and we're faced with that choice. I suppose another answer to this question is that aspect of faith and intellect in the academy. From fairly young, I was interested in studying Latter-day Saint. Back then, I just thought it was religion, right? Encompassed all of religion, but it was really just, the Latter-day Saint tradition, reading things like Parley P. Pratt's Key to the Science of Theology. Studied with an individual named Hiram Andrus. I say studied with. I was his home teaching companion.
Hiram Andrus, who's fairly legendary here at BYU, isn't he? He's a well-known author and theologian.
He is, and that was a formative experience. I was already interested in these things, but that really encouraged my interest. Ended up doing a bachelor's in history here at BYU. determined that I wanted to continue to pursue that study, so I ended up at Claremont Graduate University. What led me there? Well, the Bushmans, Richard Bushman and Claudia Bushman, had gone there as the first Mormon Studies chair. And so I determined I wanted to go study. I didn't know him, but I had read Rough Stone Rolling and wanted to go study with him. After that experience, I ended up attending UNLV, where David Holland, who is a scholar of American intellectual and religious history, was at, also a member of the church. And so that was also a formative experience. Now, my study is in that, American intellectual and religious history, but it was an incredible experience to study that topic with someone who believed as I did and who wrestled with issues as I did and who I could talk to about those sorts of things. Now, sometimes I think to some extent the question is how are you a person of faith and intellect? And in part, right, there's a little bit of an assumption there that those things are in conflict, or I suppose that those things can be in conflict. And we've seen that, especially in the last couple hundred years, how that can be the case. But just as often, thoughtful people, intellectuals, have been also religious people. I suppose we could say that we've had some anti-intellectualism in the church in times past, even among some church leaders, and perhaps there is some of that today among some of our members. But the way that I read our revelation, Joseph Smith's revelations, the way that I understand our theology is that we actually have to, at some level, be intellectuals. I have in mind section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants, to seek wisdom out of the best books, to seek learning by study and by faith. That to me is a call to be an intellectual of some sort. Now, there are different kinds of intellectuals perhaps, but at least to take seriously my own faith and everything else around me. And I feel like that is a call to be an intellectual. So I think our theology actually asks it of us. I'd like to read a quotation from B.H. Roberts.
Please, go ahead.
So Roberts cited this passage from section 88 in the last volume of his 70s course of theology. B.H. Roberts was a historian and a writer, also a president of the 70s. And he found in Joseph's revelations an imperative to apply the intellect to sacred truths, right? And he said this: men seem to think that because inspiration and revelation are factors in connection with the things of God, therefore the pain and stress of mental effort are not required. Roberts observed that it is much in fashion to laud the simple faith, which is content to believe without understanding, or even without much effort to understand. He says, and doubtless many good people regard this course as indicative of reverence, but this sort of reverence is easily simulated and falls into the same category as the simulated humility couched in, I don't know, which so often really means I don't care and do not intend to trouble myself to find out. Now, and then he goes on to say, look at all of Joseph Smith's revelations suggesting that we have to think seriously about these things. Neal A. Maxwell, toward the end of the 20th century, also cited section 88 in his call for us to be disciple scholars, and in saying that academic scholarship is a form of worship. So I guess part of my answer to that question, that as far as I understand my own religion, I can't be a person of faith without also being a person of the mind. Now, that doesn't mean we all have to go get degrees in religion or history or whatever else, but to be open to serious critical inquiry and study, I think, is demanded of us as scholars. And in that process, and as members of the church, and in that process, we're going to run up against difficult ideas, challenging ideas that perhaps even challenge our faith. And that can, I suppose, be scary, but I also see it as sort of adventurous and exciting. And because at every step of that, in that process, we still have the power, the choice to choose to believe in God, to believe in Christ, to believe in the restoration. So testimony, ultimately, our understanding of even what that is might shift and change in this process. But I think ultimately it becomes deeper, stronger, more vibrant, right? So there's so much, I think, in our theology that demands intellectual rigor and then the ability to take that theology and apply it in practice in significant, important, very earthy ways. We have, I would say, an earthy theology.
Yeah.
One that's grounded in the messiness of our lives. And that theology, I think, can help us answer the kinds of wrestles and struggles and injustices that we find in the world. We don't have a theology, right? There has sometimes been a criticism of theism, and particular versions of theism, that, well, you can just sit back and wait for the millennium, and then everything will be made right. The way I read Joseph Smith's Revelations, we don't have that kind of theology.
Right.
We do believe in the millennium, and I think we do believe in a kind of justice that will come, but we are called to be God's actors on earth. So the rooted nature of the theology, right? The fact that Joseph is developing, for example, ideas about baptism for the dead in light of his own isolation from people, et cetera, that theology then can become useful, right? If somehow God revealed truth outside of context and time, then how useful would it be to us? Well, I don't think it would be very useful. And that is, again, partly what I love about Latter-day Saint theology and the revelations and teachings that come through Joseph Smith and his scriptural productions, is that it is so rooted in the material world that I think it can, if we're careful about how we understand those documents and records and teachings, it can help us address some very difficult issues that we face.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from BYU Religious Education, Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.